The Western genre is not one that is widely explored in video games. Rockstar helped to bring this genre to the mainstream game audiences with their successful Red Dead Redemption 1 and 2 titles. And while those games are excellent, there are other Western video games that deserve attention as well. The Wild West lends itself well to a video game, with lots of options for developers to explore with exciting gameplay and engaging stories. During the PS2 generation, Capcom was working on a Western game that later ended up being released by Rockstar. Red Dead Revolver is an underrated game in their catalog, but Revolver wasn't the only Western released during that generation. At the same time, Neversoft was at work making a Western game of their own, and it was going to tell an engaging story, feature third-person combat, and an open world for the player to explore. At the time, Neversoft had spent most of its career adapting a Spider-Man game, along with creating and making new entries within their Tony Hawk series. They wanted to pivot and tackle something new and fresh for the studio. Join me as we take a look back at Gun. During the PS1 generation, Neversoft was making a name for itself. This all started when Activision hired them to save a project that was not up to their satisfaction. Neversoft was able to come in and save the game that was known as Apocalypse. At the time, this was going to be a really ambitious title that would be a buddy cop-like game that would feature Bruce Willis as your partner. When Neversoft was hired, Activision gave them under a year to finish and ship the game. As such, Neversoft went for a simpler approach, and even ditched the buddy cop aspect of the game, after focus testing stated that everyone would rather just play as Bruce Willis. This turned out to be an enjoyable twin-stick shooter and started the relationship between Activision and Neversoft. They had the opportunity to work on a new skateboarding game for the publisher as well. Activision saw the growing market and wanted to make a game for this skateboarding audience. A prototype was in the works, but Activision was not pleased with the results, so Neversoft was then entrusted with the project. Neversoft knew that they would require the aid of a professional skateboarder to ensure authenticity of the game. Professional skateboarder Tony Hawk was brought on and collaborated with the developers. When this game was released, it was a huge hit for Neversoft. With this success under their belt, Neversoft was then granted the keys to make a Spider-Man game for the PS1. Spider-Man showed that Neversoft could take an existing property and create a successful action-adventure game. For many years following this, the Tony Hawk franchise became their focus. But during the PS2 generation, after making several Tony Hawk titles, the studio wanted to explore something different. At this time, Neversoft split their studio into two teams. One team would continue to work on Tony Hawk titles, while the other was planning on working on something completely new. Neversoft was given the opportunity to work on a brand new IP. The studio was interested in tackling the Western genre. They felt that this genre was not as covered as it should be within the industry. Neversoft wanted to explore the idea of making a Western third-person shooter. This would be an open-world game that would feature a combination of third-person and first-person shooting. The player would control their character in third person, but they would make use of a quick-aim mechanic that would switch the view from third to first. This allowed the action to be more in your face and intimate through this change in view, and with the added element of it all being in slow motion. While using quick draw, players could take their time to line up shots, aim for specific body parts, or even shoot guns out of enemies' hands. Neversoft wanted to capture the brutal nature of the Wild West through these gameplay mechanics, and through the story, this would help to achieve their vision. Along with this, the developers wanted to provide combat options while on horseback. They felt that this was an area that was not tackled before and wanted to provide it in Gun. The atmosphere of the game was going to focus on the visceral and violent Wild West. At the time, the developers felt like a lot of open world games took place in modern cities, and they wanted to provide Western-style towns while also providing other areas, like the wilderness, mines, and other expected locations from the time period. The open world was going to provide the player with optional missions to complete in addition to the main story. Players could take on bounty hunting missions, helping with the local law enforcement, hunting animals, and exploring for gold. Gun would allow the player to earn money to buy upgrades and items from different shops and traders. Neversoft knew early on Gun was going to be a challenging game for the studio to make. This was their first open world game, along with being a very story-focused adventure. From a technical side of things, the open world aspect of the game provided its own challenges on the developers, as they figured out what needed to be loaded from the character to the geometry to provide a seamless experience. The developers stated this as being a bit of a puzzle for them to create and appropriately allocate memory. With this being their first open world game, the studio worked to create an AI that would react to the player, depending on if the player was walking into town, pointing a gun at them, or engaging with other enemies. To create an authentic experience, these AI needed to react correctly depending on what the player was doing. The technical side of the game, along with getting the AI right, were two of the biggest challenges on the project. In addition, the studio would set up several microphones at distances and fire off weapons that would be present within the game. The goal was to capture an accurate sound for the player's experience that was representative of the time period. It was important for Neversoft to get the story right. To sell the performances, they opted to go with using motion capture to enhance the realism of the movements from the characters. Motion capture was used a bit for the game's animations, but it was primarily used for the cutscenes. The developers would have the actors come into the studio and play out the scenes. This would be done like a stage play. Once everyone was satisfied with the scenes, then the motion captured people would come in to capture the movements from those scenes. In addition, Hollywood writer Randall Johnson was brought in to write the script. Gunn's story was going to focus on Colton White. His journey would include revenge, discovering his past, along with facing off against many different foes. He had experience with writing different films, but this would be his first time working on a video game. This was a completely different experience for him. The developers worked with the writer to create short but effective cutscenes. Their goal was to make something that was concise so the player did not want to skip the story portions of the game. Along with this, the writer learned how video game writing is vastly different than film because of the interaction portion of it, and this involved writing differently. The cutscene portions of the story were similar to a film with a clear beginning and end, but the side missions and how the player can ignore the story for portions of the game to do other activities needed to be accounted for within the script and flow naturally. To provide quality audio performances, Neversoft had an impressive cast full of Hollywood actors. The cast featured Thomas Jane, Chris Christopherson, Brad Dourif, Ron Perlman, and many more. Gun was going to be a big departure for the studio, but also an example of how the developers wanted to explore a new genre. Gun showed how they wanted to challenge themselves with something new and tackle an open-world game set in the Wild West. Neversoft aimed to provide quality shooting gameplay with a large area to explore, all wrapped up in an engaging story. Gun was definitely an ambitious project for the studio, but with their prior work with Spider-Man and Tony Hawk, they showed how they were up to the task. In November 2005, Gun was released to the world.
Let's settle this thing! If you got the balls.
The main focus of Gun's gameplay is on the shooting. The player controls Cole from the third person. When it comes to the action, it is violent and in some cases delightfully over the top. Enemies will react to your hits, usually moving in pain from your shots. In many cases, rifles and shotguns can cause heads to explode. A quick melee option is provided for when enemies get up close. The regular shooting is very satisfying due to the reactions from the enemies and the violence that results from it. If you hit an enemy with your shotgun, this will cause them to comically fly back, leaving a trail of blood behind them. I never got tired of aiming for people's heads as they would explode. The combat has aged well and it's still fun to this day. Cole has access to plenty of different weapons to give a decent amount of options to the players. Pistols are reliable and never run out of ammo. Rifles are great for any situation. Snipers have a low fire rate but do a lot of damage. In addition, both the rifles and sniper rifles can be aimed in first person, making it easier to pick off targets. The shotguns are great for up-close action and contending with some of the rushing enemies. You can really feel the power behind your shotguns with their pushback. Melee is another option, but not the focus of the game. When you swing your weapon, you will sort of auto lock-on to the closest enemy. This can get a bit messy if you decide to fight several foes at once, but it gets the job done for a few enemies. You can opt to take an enemy as a human shield if you damage them and then run up to them and grab them. They will eventually break free, but you can use this as a good opportunity to have some more protection as you take out a lot of enemies. Another nice touch is how whiskey is used like a medkit to restore your health. Now, easily the best part about the combat is the quick draw. As you kill enemies, you will fill your quick draw meter. When you activate quick draw, the camera will change from third to first person and go into slow-mo. You can take the time to freely aim at your targets, focusing on their heads or shooting their guns out of their hands. The quick draw also allows you to quickly switch between new targets very easily. The switching between third to first person is done very smoothly, and I think the slow-mo helps to aid in that transition. The quick draw is an excellent feature that fits the Western setting and makes the player feel like those quick shooters in Western films. I never got tired of using the quick draw and aiming for heads. Watching heads explode and shooting off chunks of someone's face is over the top, but this is great impact for the shooting within this game. For defensive options, the player can crouch behind most objects along with rolling to dodge enemy fire. The player can also use a lean mechanic to shoot from cover as well. Being that this is a Western, there is going to be some horseback riding. Riding your horse is very easy to control, and it's enjoyable to shoot from it as well. The main missions do not have a dud in them. Each one provides exciting shooting situations. They provide a good amount of variety to the tasks that you need to complete. In many cases, you need to take out all the targets, or you need to protect someone or chase an enemy down. The open world does provide side missions for you to complete. You can do bounty hunting missions, and in these missions, you are tasked with bringing in one target. You have the option to bring them in dead or alive. If you can bring them in alive, you get more money for it. This can be a bit tricky since many of the targets have allies of their own that want to take you out. There are other side missions like helping the local law enforcement with keeping the peace, delivering missions, hunting missions, and a lot more. The open world is not the most involved and can be pretty empty at times, but it does have just enough to keep it interesting. It is fun to explore the open world and find gold to collect, along with additional missions to complete or people to trade with. One aspect that I thought was cool was how random bandits will try to attack you while you are exploring. You can opt to fight them or run away. Completing side missions will net you with money along with improving your stats. The money is really useful as you can buy upgrades to your weapons and items at different shops. Your stats will increase at the end of each mission, but I never really noticed a difference to my character with them. The upgrades that you buy in the shops you will really notice, like faster reloads and more power to your weapons. When it comes to the gameplay, the action is still awesome to this day. The third-person shooting is enjoyable along with the quick draw mechanic. The over-the-top violence keeps the shooting satisfying, and while the open world could use more refinement, it is really enjoyable to ride around on your horse collecting gold and finding new missions to complete. I absolutely love this game. There are a few flaws that I want to point out. The AI in this game is not the smartest. They are generally pretty dumb. There will be situations where they just stand there and forget about you, or outright ignore you in a shootout. The large amount of them and the damage they deal means that they still provide a nice challenge. My only big flaw with the game are the boss fights. These mainly consist of bullet sponge enemies that feel out of place in this game. The bosses will take several headshots before dying, while regular enemies will only take one hit to the head before going down. In other games, this would probably fit better, but not in a Western. While the game is very focused with its brisk and well-told story and fun side missions, I just wish that there was double the side content within this game. Gun is so much fun to the player that I just wanted more of it.
Sure took you sweet time.
I was just admiring your rifle.
Another tick or two and you'd be putting me to bed with a pick and shovel.
You're too damn ornery to die.
Well, it prides me to see it's rubbed off on you plenty. Always remember, son, in this world, pure cussedness will carry you farther than a Comanche's pony. Ah, here's our payday.
While the core third-person shooting is still solid and very satisfying with over-the-top violence, Gun's story is another excellent part about the game. The story does a good job of hooking you in with exciting situations, revenge, mystery, some treasure hunting, along with high quality voice acting and a great execution. The story follows Colton White as he's on a path for revenge and discovering some mysteries from his past. Mixed in is a long lost treasure and the villains that are after it. Along the way, we see Cole learn about his past, forge new alliances to help overthrow an evil group of people. Gun's story takes a more popcorn western approach rather than being an in-depth narrative. The characters here are mostly one note with some nice moments to give them some development, but do not expect the most in-depth heroes and villains. While the characters are not the most in-depth, that doesn't mean that the narrative isn't good. Even to this day, I still consider this a great story. What keeps the narrative so strong is the execution of it. The story has a brisk pacing and never lets up. There's always new situations, allies, betrayals, and events going on. This allows the game to bounce back and forth between cutscenes and gameplay very well, as there are many cutscenes, but they are short and to the point. You have heroes that you really want to root for, and foes that really chew up the scene when they are present. Cole is a good leading character. He is focused on his mission of revenge, but takes every opportunity to help people along the way. He has a code, and it's interesting early on when we see him act on this code. We see this when we discover two lawmen who attack two unarmed people. What really makes Cole come alive is the pretty good writing mixed with the excellent delivery by Thomas Jane. There's a nice mix of darkness and humor to many of his lines. Like I said, the characters here are not the most developed, but they are given just enough to make you care about the story and their dangerous situations that they are in. The voice actors really bring these characters to life. You enjoy being around the different side characters along with loving to hate the villains. Reed is a great example of this. He is an over-the-top priest and acts as the main bad guy's number 2. He is played by Brad Dourif and he chews every scene that he's in. Magruder is a solid main villain as well. He is focused, selfish, and dangerous. He only cares about himself and his legacy and will not let anyone get in his way. Now, I will admit that there are some dumb and silly moments throughout the story, but for the most part, this is a solid narrative that is extremely engaging. It hooks you with the beginning hour, provides some good heroes and villains, an interesting story, and a satisfying conclusion. Whenever I look back to Gun, I think of the violent shooting along with the story that I am happy to return back to. The game may look dated and would benefit from a remaster, but the gameplay and especially the story stand strong and place themselves in a timeless category for their quality. Before we move to the conclusion, I need to praise the excellent soundtrack within this game. The composer has worked on other Western projects before, and he does a fantastic job here. The music uses instruments that you would expect to hear, along with creating unique and memorable tracks. Here are a few tracks from the game. Gun is a criminally underrated third-person shooter. This was the first open-world Western title, and it got so much right. The story has great pacing with enjoyable characters and villains. The main missions are all enjoyable with no bad mission out of the bunch. The shooting is intense and violent with lots of blood and dismemberment. The quick draw mechanic is a nice implementation of bullet time within the Western setting. While the open world is not the most densely packed, it is enjoyable to search for gold and complete side missions. When it comes to the gameplay and story, Gun has aged very well. Visually, this game could benefit from a remaster to improve the graphics and show this game to a new generation. At the beginning of the 360 generation, Neversoft did have the opportunity to create a sequel, but sadly they did not have the resources to continue with their Tony Hawk franchise and Gun, so they opted to leave Gun behind. While I would love a sequel, I would settle with a remaster or a visual remake. Gun is a well-told, self-contained story. Gun is easily one of my favorite games, and I absolutely love it. Thank you very much for watching.